All right, hello and welcome to the Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon virtual Congress Week 2021. My name is Ashton Ellett. I'm the Politics and Public Policy Archivist here at the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies. Our guest today is Tamar Hallerman, Senior Reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. But before I introduce Tamar, let me first welcome our two esteemed moderators for this afternoon's event, Audrey Haynes and Joseph Watson. Audrey Haynes is Associate Professor and Josiah Meigs Distinguished Teaching Professor in the University of Georgia's Department of Political Science. Her research interests include elections in the media, presidential nomination process, and political parties. Since 2016, Audrey has served as the director of the Applied Politics Certificate Program here at UGA, and she is a regular contributor to GPB's Political Rewind with Bill Nigut. Joseph Watson is the inaugural Carolyn Caudell Teeger Professor of Public Affairs Communication at UGA's Grady College, and he is the director of the Public Affairs Communications Program. Prior to coming to UGA, Joe led the Public Affairs Communications Group for the Exelon Corporation and served as an associate administrator in the U.S. Department of Commerce. An experienced Capitol Hill staffer, he worked as legislative counsel and legislative director for former United States Senator Peter Fitzgerald of the great state of Illinois. Thank you, Audrey and Joe, for agreeing to moderate today's Congress Week event. We really do appreciate that. And now I'd like to introduce the star of the show, Tamar Hallerman. Tamar is senior reporter at the AJC, where she covers politics, public policy, current events, and everything else under the sun these days. Prior to becoming senior reporter, Tamar covered Capitol Hill for almost a decade as AJC's Washington correspondent, a CQ roll call staff writer, and an intern with NPR and the Durango Herald. A native of Blacksburg, Virginia, Tamar is a graduate of the American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, virtually, of course, still, to the Russell Library here at UGA, Tamar.
Thanks for
Uh,
having me. I'm sad I couldn't be there to see it in person, but one
it,
of these days, hopefully, I'll get to make the trip.
Sooner rather than later, hopefully, Tamar. Before we get started, did I forget anything or did I omit anything?
I spent a couple years in the middle there writing about energy policy for a little trade publication in DC, covering the Department of Energy, the EPA, and a lot of the energy committees on Capitol Hill. And spent a lot of my formative years in college doing public radio for various stations covering Congress and a bunch of other issues. So I've gotten to cover politics in Capitol Hill from a couple different angles that I'm sure we can talk about later.
Great, great. So, for everyone joining us from wherever you are out there, thank you. If you have any questions, please submit those in the Q&A form, and we'll do our best to work those questions in toward the ends of the program. So, without further ado, I'd like to kick off today's event with the first question, which is, Tamar, how did you first get interested in journalism, or how did you first get interested in politics, and did those two work in tandem with each
They
other?
did. They did not. I got into journalism much earlier in high school. I was always interested in writing in English, and my high school didn't really offer many creative writing classes. So very quickly, one of the only courses of action I did have was to enroll in our high school newspaper class. So I kind of caught the bug in high school, and I didn't fall into politics until much later in college. I had quit an internship at a newspaper that ended up being data entry, and it killed my soul and I hated it. And I ended up falling into, it's a little public radio nonprofit that doesn't exist anymore called Capital News Connection. And it was weeks after Barack Obama had gotten sworn in as president. And so they kind of stuck a microphone in my hand and said, hey, you're going to cover Capitol Hill for us. So we got to cover all the debates on Capitol Hill through the lens of whatever local city, our public radio station was based in. So I'd cover something like the budget. What does that mean for Miami? What does that mean for Atlanta or Baltimore? And so that was my initial introduction into it. And I just kind of fell in love from there. Capitol Hill is such a unique world, especially as a journalist. It's just a really cool place to cover. So I quickly fell in love and knew that I wanted to start my career, at least, pursuing that.
So, you're talking about your first your first jobs as a reporter. How did that relate? How did that experience relate to? You mentioned Capitol Hill is a very special place. How is it different to cover Congress than something else as a journalist or a reporter?
I mean, for starters, the access is like nothing you've ever seen before. It's not like the White House where there's like a briefing room, and as a reporter, you're really restricted to that one press area of the White House. In Congress, once you get a media credential, you can walk around with almost as much access as a senator has or a staff member, and you can walk around unattended. It's not like you have some minder or some press secretary saying, hey, you can't talk to that person, you can't go there. So you can literally walk up to any lawmaker you want. You can walk up to Mitch McConnell. You can walk up to Nancy Pelosi and ask them a question. And so it's chaos, but it makes it so much fun because there's so many lawmakers with agendas to walk. There's always stories to tell. You can tell the story of the day that a lot of the members of the press corps are pursuing, or you can talk to some random lawmaker who maybe has a great scoop for you, and it can just take you in a million different directions. And because it is sort of a reactive institution sometimes, it is so much fun to watch news kind of unfold in real time there, watch Capitol Hill kind of react to it. And that excitement is what really kept me going. And, that's why I love the beat and did it for as long as I did.
Well, Joe, Audrey, would you guys like to take the next questions?
Sure,
Or?
I can pivot to the next question,
Sure.
Ashton, if that's okay. Tomorrow,
Absolutely.
it's great to be here with you and to talk to someone who has such a love for the Congress and American politics. It's such a great amount of fun here. I guess the question that I wanted to ask is that one of the things that struck me, and I was a staffer for a number of years, but it wasn't until after I left that I realized how many of the stories that you see in Washington seem to come from Capitol Hill. It's like Capitol Hill drives the news cycle. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about how instrumental the Congress is in terms of generating what we see every night when we turn on the nightly news or check our social media feeds.
Sure. Well, I think one of the reasons, you see so much come out of Capitol Hill rather than the White House sometimes is because the White House, and Donald Trump's White House is the exception to this, but in general, information is kept under really tight control there. And on Capitol Hill, it's such a leaky sieve, right? You have, 535, crazy people who all have agendas, who all have egos, who all have things that they want to prove. And so they want to tell members of the press about it. So it makes it really hard for anybody to really keep a secret. And once it's out of the bag, it's really impossible to kind of tamp down. So that's why you see it. You have so many lawmakers there who represent every corner of the country. So there's nothing happening around the country that people don't have opinions on in Capitol Hill, or people don't think that they can help solve it for better or worse, and want to get their hands on it. So I think that's why you see so much of it. And as I mentioned, it's a very reactive institution. So often when there are things happening around the country, you have these lawmakers who want to get their hands on it. We want to be the ones to solve it. And so that often leads to chaos. Especially given how gridlocked we are, they often don't solve it. But there's all these people who feel like they need to because their constituents are telling them, because their egos are telling them, but they want to get in on that action.
Let me follow up and ask you a question, which everybody who follows politics right now is kind of chomping at the bit for former Speaker John Boehner's new book, which is coming out. And it's like every day, for those of us who read, political news clippings or whatever, there's like another excerpt. So you're like, I already read my excerpt for today, and hopefully there's another excerpt tomorrow that's being teased out. And I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to how much American politics has changed from the era of John Boehner's speakership. When he was the speaker for for part of President Obama's tenure in the White House. It seems like so much has changed, and it just seems like, and I want to get your take on this. But the thing is that people who were in Washington at the time that John Boehner was speaker, there were things that made him, kind of stand out as a human being, as speaker. And it reminds me of something that one of my former professors in law school used to say, and he'd say that if certain people, litigants in certain cases, didn't exist, you'd have to make them up. And it almost seems like John Boehner is like that. If John Boehner didn't exist as this Merlot, cigarette smoking, golfing speaker, it's almost like you'd have to create a persona like that. But all the things that made him so much John Boehner also seem to be the things that sowed the seeds of his ultimate downfall. And I'd love to get your take on the book and that saga.
Yeah, well, I am eagerly awaiting the book. And I will say that as somebody, I don't typically like political biographies. I'm the kind of person, when I'm off work, I want to like read fiction. I want to kind of escape. But those clips look so juicy that I've already pre-ordered my copy. I'm very excited. John Boehner's an interesting guy, right? In many ways, he's a throwback to the old Washington. As you said, loves his Merlot, loves his cigarettes, loves to golf. There's a very famous Italian restaurant on Capitol Hill that he was known to be at every single night in a private back room, literally a smoke-filled room that he would hang out in, and people would come to him if they needed something. And so part of that is super old school, right? He loved people, he loved wheeling and dealing. He loved that game. At the same time, he came, his political rise began in 1994 with the Newt Gingrich contract with America, when I think a lot of people saw that as a real turning point in Washington, where we started seeing the origins of a lot of the kind of sharp-elbowed, kind of sharp-edged politics. Newt Gingrich made a lot of internal changes on Capitol Hill that helped change the culture a lot. And John Boehner was kind of right there with him. At the same time, because he was so old school, I think that ultimately kind of sowed a lot of the seeds that led to his ouster, about 5 years ago.
Tamar, do you think that it hurt him with the base that he seemed to enjoy being in Washington? I've often thought that we almost have an attitude amongst the base. It doesn't matter whether it's the base on the left or the base on the right, but it's almost like if it seems like you're having fun or you're actually enjoying it or you're enjoying the company of other people that you work with, it's almost like there's a double take, like, wait, whoa, wait a minute. You're not supposed to like the other person. You're not supposed to, I mean, and he seems to me to be the last person who I can genuinely say, if you were to see him, he was happy. He was not sullen. He was not angry. He was not, I mean, he might be ticked off about something at a moment, but he was not like walking around with a cloud over his head or anything. He was someone who just kind of like enjoyed being speaker and enjoyed being a member. And I feel like now there's almost an element that to the extent that there are members and senators that truly do feel that way, they are almost taught to hide it.
Absolutely. I mean, look at cable news, look at social media. It makes an enemy of you if yeah, God forbid you like your job, God forbid you like somebody of the other party, or even somebody within your party who might be on the other side, might be much more centrist or might be much more liberal. You're not rewarded for doing that anymore. And because of the way that our primary system works, you're incentivized to go even more to one side or the other. The middle has kind of caved. And the gulf has only widened with time. So it makes it a lot harder for somebody like John Boehner, who would want to cut a deal at the end of the day. That's what, those positions were created to do in Washington, but they are becoming more and more disincentivized with time to cut those deals. And so it makes it much, much harder for somebody like him to do that job. And often there's not much glamour to that, right? You have to sit in that smoke-filled room and cut a deal and give the other side something. But that's no longer acceptable on social media or on the base and on cable news, and so you're demonized for it, and it puts people in a no-win situation. Paul Ryan would say the exact same thing. It makes it really hard to do the basic things that that governing requires you to, like keep the government open, like to lift the debt ceiling, and so it is not a fun job for anyone, I would say.
Do you think, and this is my last question, I want to let others, let Audrey jump in, but I want to follow up with this. I don't know if you ever had the occasion, because I don't read a lot of political memoirs either, but this one always struck me, and it was because of who wrote it and who it was written about. But President George W. Bush wrote a book about Bush 41 called 41. And in it, the thing that strikes me as a parallel with the Boehner book is there's this undercurrent of antipathy for the base of the party. And when you talk to John Boehner, in my time talking to John Boehner, I'm curious if you got this sense whenever you talked to him, there kind of was this disdain for the partisan, even the Tea Party element that helped give him his majority, like that he didn't really like love the Tea Party rank and file. And you get the sense even in 41 where the early iterations of that, like the Bushes never really liked that element of the party at all. And it almost seems like in a way Boehner's the last person who almost openly had a level of antipathy and disdain for that segment. To the extent that that exists now for people like Mitch McConnell, whatever, they hide it deep if it exists. And I'm quite positive it does exist, but I think they do a much better job of doing it. But with Boehner, it seems like he didn't really conceal that.
Yeah, I don't think he did either. And you can see in his comments about people like Ted Cruz or in the Freedom Caucus, where he was very open about how much he couldn't stand those people. And he was a speaker during a really pivotal time, right? That was when the Tea Party wave made him speaker back in 2010, and that was a movement that really prized partisan purity. And then, in many ways that made it super difficult. Like I said, to do the parts of his job that were required of it. He had to deliver votes to keep the government open and to lift the debt ceiling. Those are not sexy issues, but those are pretty much the only two things the government has to do. So it made it extremely hard for him to do his job. Or even on an issue, it's not required, but the vast majority of the American people want you to do something on immigration or on healthcare. If you have a base that's constantly telling you everything you do is not conservative enough, if you make any sort of concession to the other side, which again, you're going to need to do in Washington, it's never going to be good enough. That makes it awfully hard to operate if you're a John Boehner. And it is pretty amazing to see how openly he did that, because I could never imagine a Kevin McCarthy or a Mitch McConnell ever saying anything like that, because they know that their careers would be over at this point.
Yeah, and even if you think about the way in which, I just think about as Obama was leaving the White House and he did his final appearance at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and they do this little, traditionally the president will do a little reel or footage, and I don't know if you remember the one that Obama did for his going out. It was kind of like, what is he going to do with all of his time? And like, he invites John Boehner to come in, and John Boehner's in the film, and they're like walking around the White House, and Boehner's trying to, seduce President Obama into having a cigarette, saying, Michelle will never know, just have a puff or whatever. And it just seemed like, even though they had obviously political disagreements, it just seemed like Boehner's the kind of guy who probably would want to have a glass of wine with anybody, let alone Obama or whatever. And I think it almost seems like he resented not being given the space to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with the rise of Donald Trump, it became more and more impossible for a Republican leader, especially, to ever, God forbid, shoot a video where they'd be next to, somebody like a Barack Obama or any Democratic leader. And so, it looks harder and harder to be able to do anything, like even a silly video. We're not even talking about heavy legislating here. And that goes to show kind of where the climate is right now in Washington.
Yeah.
Well, if I could jump in, Joe, you asked so many interesting questions, and I want to follow up on one federal one, since we're talking about Congress Week, and you mentioned Newt Gingrich and the contract with America, and that's where we started to see the nationalization of politics, where you really weren't able to respond to your district or your state independently without that super party pressure, whereas before it was excused, it was understandable. And then we move into the media and social media, where newspapers don't dominate quite as much in delivering content. So even if you wanted to be bipartisan and hang out, everyone would know it. And someone would probably tweet out about it. So you don't have any cover. There's almost so much sunshine and transparency. So given, your time there, I wanted to talk about how difficult it is covering Congress, and whether you feel like there's uphill battles to get out a real story, even, and not even at this moment, but even prior to that. How do you get information to people when it's already difficult? We know that people have very limited information about Congress, right? In terms of what they follow. Often the stories they do follow are scandal or negativity, not the positive, not the process, not, what's delivered. So as a journalist who has covered Congress, what do you think these new societal changes, the polarization, social media, what has that done to your ability to really cover the story well and not have to sort of battle so much disinformation or framing of events? That's a long-winded question. I'm so sorry.
And there's so many aspects to this that I want to talk about. And it's really hard. There's a constant push and pull internally, like my own head, with my editors and my colleagues about what's news, what we want to cover, with our audience who, they tend to maybe watch a lot of cable news and have feelings about the things we are or are not covering. And it makes it really difficult. And I always really pushed, I'm such a policy dork, and I've always wanted to also make sure, in addition to all the scandals, which we kind of have to cover, it's sort of required, I want to cover policy, what Georgia's lawmakers were doing on various important national issues, or talk about what they were pushing for behind the scenes. And, but often, the audience wouldn't respond to it. People like scandal, they want the sexy stuff. And so how it was a little discouraging, especially during the rise of Donald Trump, where it really truly was this magnet, for eyeballs, but also, you could spend a week on a deeply reported story about name your issue, healthcare, taxes, the environment, and it would get 1/10 of the clicks of something, that Donald Trump said, that, you did no reporting, you just pulled together what other people were saying. And so, I think the AJC has been debated over the last couple of years how to balance all of that. And as has every publication. And I don't necessarily know if we've come to a good place about where that balance is, right? What do we owe our readers? We have to cover those things Donald Trump said and how our delegation responded to it. But, their offices would also get mad, our local lawmakers, if we weren't also covering the stuff they were doing day to day. And that made it tough. Especially when readers were demanding, whatever nationalized stuff was coming out on social media or what was coming out on cable news. They don't necessarily care about those parochial issues that maybe we would have spent more time covering 20, 30 years ago as a newspaper.
Now, Ashton, I see that we have some questions in the chat, and I don't want to, not allow those great participants to ask those questions. They look pretty interesting.
Sure. What the first question we have is actually, what was the environment like on the Hill as a female reporter? Joe and you just spent so much time talking about John Boehner as sort of the throwback to the good old boys club of politics in Washington. What was the dynamic like, and how was it similar or different from a dynamic from your male colleagues?
It really varied depending on who you were talking to, which lawmakers. And the thing on Capitol Hill is everyone's really old. Elected officials are old. In general, the average age, especially in the Senate, is like in the 70s. And so these are often old dudes who have never had sexual harassment training in their entire lives, or who couldn't grapple with the Me Too movement. And so I was really stunned the first time I kind of went there. I remember seeing one senator with his mistress, and kind of everyone knew that it was his mistress, and it was such an open secret. And I remember being an intern and being shocked. Everyone knows this man is married, and oh yeah, it's him and his mistress. Yeah, of course. I learned really quickly with certain lawmakers that I had to deal with, older ones kind of in their 80s. I dress a little more conservatively than maybe I would have at the beginning, because lots of little touches which really bothered me, on the arm or on the lower back. And so I certainly started dressing a little more conservatively early on, because especially when I started on Capitol Hill, I was 19, 20 years old. I already was kind of young. I was in college. Didn't really know what I was doing, and being taken seriously, I knew would be an issue. So I started dressing, always with a blazer, never showing my shoulders, skirts at the knee, which is not something, normally I would care much for. That certainly helped, but no, it has been a constant fight. What am I going to need to be taken seriously? And I'm lucky, nothing terrible happened to me beyond more than anything, just patronizing comments. They're there, little girl. There was one member of the House who ended up becoming a very, very powerful man in Washington. And the first time I interviewed him when I was about 19 or 20 off of the House floor, it was a State of the Union address, when lawmakers often bring a member of their family to come with him. And his daughter was there, who I guess was in high school, but a little younger. And so here I am trying to ask him a question about some serious issue, healthcare or whatever. And he's like, oh, you should talk to my daughter about this. And that made me so angry. Here I am working, trying to ask you a serious question. But I mean, compared to some of the other stuff that women have talked about, I believe it was Kirsten Gillibrand in her book talking about something another senator told her, about sleeping with her. I think I got off a lot easier. At the same time, I get super upset at portrayals of female journalists in film and television. Like House of Cards makes me so angry, and just kind of this perception that female reporters always sleep with their sources or are willing to do that, especially on Capitol Hill. That's not something I ever came across, and I really get upset when I see those portrayals on film. But it has been a constant struggle for me as a young woman, especially covering a delegation in the South, which for a while, when I was the Washington correspondent, there were a couple years where there were no women in the Georgia delegation. And here I am, a woman in my 20s at the time, covering a bunch of men in their 50s and 60s and 70s. Like, I need you to take me seriously. And it took a while, but I think after a while, they saw how serious my questions were and that I wasn't, I wasn't playing around. And I think they figured it out. Or I'd like to think that anyway.
You're talking about covering the Georgia delegation, and that led me to think about what were the differences? What were the key differences between your work on the Hill as a staff writer for Roll Call, and then making that transition from Roll Call, which is online and a magazine, to a major daily newspaper for a major metropolitan city?
It was extremely different. I spent my first year at the AJC wanting to cry every day because I felt like I had to unlearn everything I had ever learned and relearn it, right? Because before, CQ Roll Call's audience, they are often lobbyists. They are staffers on Capitol Hill. They are lawmakers themselves. These are people who already are deeply invested in Capitol Hill and know the lingo. They know the acronyms. They know the issues. You don't have to make a case to them about why they need to care about something. You don't have to boil it down so much. So you can really kind of cover the incremental news without having to dive into, and this is why you need to care. This is why you, average Joe in this city, need to care. Like, no, they already need to care for work. And so in certain ways that made my job easier. Once I covered the budget process and annual spending bills. So it's a very wonky topic, but once you kind of learn it, it's very easy because you're just doing it incrementally. Once I got to the AJC, you're writing for a general audience. These are people who know nothing about how something like the federal budget process works. They don't know who these lawmakers are. They might know whatever cable news tells them or their social media feed, but often that's distorted or wrong. And so you have to spend a lot of time explaining that backstory. And you're presenting things in a much different way. You're reporting things in a different way. And yeah, so it's a much different approach. And it was hard for me in that first year. But I think it's far more rewarding once you do explain something and you're able to shed light on something that maybe a reader in Georgia would not read anywhere else because no one else is covering it.
Just one quick follow-up. You mentioned lobbyists and sort of career practitioners that you worked with or interacted with CQ Roll Call. Were lobbyists and folks like that regular sources when you were with Roll Call, and did that carry over into your work with the AJC as well?
Yeah, lobbyists were a huge help in my job at CQ, but it really was also just more lawmaker focused. Because I was covering the budget and spending bills, I was covering a lot of shutdown showdowns, especially in Obama's later years when the Tea Party was kind of in full swing, and so a lot of it really was this kind of 11th hour negotiations. Is the government going to shut down tomorrow or not? And so a lot of it was literally standing in a hallway outside of whatever meeting that Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi are in, grabbing that lawmaker, being there with the throngs of reporters that kind of launch themselves at them when they come out. Is the government shutting down? What can you tell us? So it was a lot more literally legwork of literally standing in hallways to find out the latest on these negotiations in that old job, because that's what mattered so much to all of these trade organizations or to other offices. The AJC gig, we would kind of let the AP cover something like that for us. We would let the national publications. I would be looking for local angles around that, or what are our lawmakers doing? that might not be on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow, but that's something that still matters a lot to Georgia readers. Was somebody like Johnny Isaacson doing something, maybe he's in a side room and he's negotiating a part of that, but maybe, it's not the leadership level stuff. It still is extremely important to our readers. So, or, maybe if the government shut down, it was going to impact, a federal agency with a huge footprint in Georgia, the CDC, or, it could impact the Savannah port. I was always trying to find those kind of local angles. This is why you need to care about this government shutdown, because it could mean X to you in your backyard. And the national publications wouldn't cover it that way.
So it looks like we've got some more questions.
We do. Can I ask a quick one though, Ashton?
Go ahead, Audrey. Go ahead.
We'll you just mentioned the national media might not be covering it. I know in talking to both you and Greg Bluestein, there have been stories of what has gone on in sort of Georgia politics that sometimes have, gained a life of their own. We're certainly getting much more attention. How difficult is it on someone like yourself who, you have all of this experience and now you're focused on Georgia public policy. And when you see something that is being covered, it inside and out, and then you see the narrative is somewhat different or, framed a very particular way, what's your obligation as a reporter covering public policy and legislative process to kind of make sure that, can you correct that narrative? Do you push back as a journalist, or do you just write the story and be as truthful as possible? What goes on in your mind when you hear and see those things?
Yeah, it's a real balancing act. I always try and rely on my expertise as somebody who covers those people or those issues often, because I know, after years of doing this, I kind of trust that instinct. I will say sometimes, as you mentioned, these stories or these issues might take on a life of their own. And sometimes, I do like to take time at the end of the day. I don't want to read the national coverage as I'm writing my own story, because I don't want it to taint the way I'm looking at an issue as I'm writing. But sometimes at the end of the day, I'll look and see, is there something that we really need to address, even if I think it's kind of dumb or reductive? If it does become the national narrative, sometimes you do need to take a couple hours and kind of explain, here's why it is not like this, or here's why it is like this. And, but it's hard. And it's, especially given how much more of a battleground Georgia has become, especially in the last year and a half since I've moved down here, it's becoming harder and harder. And you see it especially in the voting issue. And Stacey Abrams, who's become such a national figure. And so sometimes it does become hard to kind of back up and explain, no, here's why our coverage might be a little different. We can't only have Stacey Abrams' voice in this story. People, I often find the national press, they don't want to cover Republicans in the state as much. They're interested in the Stacey Abrams angle, which I understand, she's a political star. But you can't ignore the Republicans who are still in charge of the state legislature. They still have, most of the statewide offices. And I often feel like the national publications aren't covering what they're doing day to day. And I think that's what's lacking. And that's the context that we try and infuse in our stories.
One exception to that, Tamar, seems to be Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who seems to get an outsized amount of her coverage from national outlets rather than in-state or maybe even regional outlets. Can you talk about that? And I know you're not in Washington to cover her anymore, but that dynamic, and it seems that you've alluded to that dynamic emerging and evolving over time, over the years that you were in Washington, sort of the rise of the we'll call them the vocal backbencher. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, and that's something, we struggle with as well, because it's not like she has any power right now. She doesn't have power legislatively. She doesn't sit on any committees right now. She's a member of the minority party. At the same time, she has a giant megaphone on social media. And the fact that the press is covering her so closely, pounding on everything she does, that's clearly a huge source of strength and power for her. And we just saw in her latest fundraising, she raised something like $3 million last quarter, which is unheard of. for a backbencher freshman Republican. I mean, AOC, I think, raised about 700,000, which is also extremely good for a young member. So
and there were small dollar donations too. That's
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. So there's a question: how much are you enabling her as a reporter by covering every tiny little thing she does? You know, she clearly feeds on having that outrage. At the same time, she is an important. You know, she's becoming a national player, and we can't ignore what she's doing. So it's a constant item of discussion internally. And I don't know if we found the greatest balance yet, but kind of we take it day by day and try and cover it where we can. And yeah, still learning how to, I don't think the media ever really learned how to do it, even with somebody like Donald Trump. And so it's hard. He kind of broke our formula for how we used to cover politicians. And you know, the press got a lot of criticism initially, especially in 2015 after he came down his gold escalator at Trump Tower. You know, do we cover every crazy thing he says? What's our obligation? Or did we feed into it? You know, did we help him, give him that platform? And what's really our role here? And I don't know if anyone really figured it out.
Well, speaking of that amplification, Tamar, you know, I got the last Marjorie Taylor Greene fundraiser email because I'm on every list, it seems. And, you know, a big part of the framing of that was, you know, Biden is basically Satan and it's the end of times and you need to send me money so we can fight against that. How do you cover a message that basically focuses on revelation and the fact that the world is going to end? You know, I mean, that's really hard. When you cover it, sometimes you amplify what might seem to be, I mean, it goes along with like the QAnon things, like in covering it, are you mainstreaming those ideas? Are you planting those ideas? How, as a journalist, do you have to, you know, deal with that issue?
Yeah, it's tough, especially when it's obvious falsehoods, you know, the Jewish space lasers or something like that. And, or if it's hateful speech against Muslims or Asian Americans. And, you know, if you do cover it, you know, we try and cover it without maybe repeating hateful words that she might say, or we'll say, you know, this is false without going into it if we can, you know, sometimes you have to. But maybe you don't necessarily cover a crazy statement just as a standalone thing. You need to provide all that context to help say why this is so crazy or why this is so wrong. But it's hard, especially when QAnon has clearly become such a huge political force, and it's kind of hard to ignore. Especially, you know, they're showing up at Republican rallies, and I remember Buddy Carter, a member of the Georgia delegation from the Savannah area, got in trouble recently. I can't remember if he was attending a rally. It was like a stop it had something to do with children getting kidnapped and stuff, but it was like a QAnon thing. And I don't know if he didn't realize it, you know, and he got into hot water for that. And it's hard sometimes, especially when some of these Republican members are getting elected to Congress. And, you know, are people looking the other way? Are they denouncing it enough? It's a hard line to, you know, and that's kind of a challenge for us as well.
Tamar, can I interject a question? Because we've kind of talked about a Marjorie on one extreme, kind of like a Marjorie Taylor Greene, but earlier you alluded to Johnny Isaacson, who's kind of like just a foundational, pragmatic workhorse behind the scenes kind of legislator. And I'm curious, you know, Georgia for a long time had individuals, whether it's Johnny Isaacson or even on the other side of the aisle, a John Lewis that just kind of like loomed larger than their parties or their institutions did in regard in the state. And I'm wondering if you have a crystal ball, if you see anyone looming in that mold yet, if you see anyone who's trying to take on those roles, because those were very unique roles. And, you know, to me, it's like, you know, as a senator, people, you know, this is the Richard Russell. I mean, people want to say, who's the next Richard Russell? And they would want to aspire to that in terms of that gravitas. And I'm wondering if you see legislators, based on your interactions in the delegation, that you see are trying to position themselves to be the next John Lewis or the next Johnny Isaacson for the delegation?
You know, I wrote when Johnny Isaacson retired in December 2019 that there was no one that was going to fill his shoes. There was nobody with that gravitas, with that respect on the other side, with that kind of decades of experience cutting deals that could kind of fill that role. And unfortunately, I don't think stuff like that is in vogue anymore on either side. And so Johnny Isakson was almost grandfathered in as a Republican. As we mentioned, it's become less and less sexy, especially with kind of those Freedom Caucus, Tea Party type Republicans. You know, you're not allowed to negotiate or talk to the other side. That's a liability to you in a Republican primary and in a Democratic primary now, frankly. But Johnny Isakson was grandfathered in because he helped create the modern Republican Party in Georgia. You know, he was there when it was like 10 people, you know, talk about permanent minority status. And so he got grandfathered into the system, and that gave him a lot of freedom to operate in a way that I would argue Republicans can't operate right now on Capitol Hill. As for John Lewis, I mean, nobody could ever be John Lewis. Nobody, you know, has got the physical scars on their body on being, you know, the front lines of the civil rights movement like John Lewis. And so nobody will have that moral weight of him in the Congress. Probably, you know, nobody, Democrat or Republican in any state, comes close to that. And so that was a really unique role. And the delegation's in an interesting place right now because so many people ended up stepping aside to run for higher office last year. You know, you saw Doug Collins, who I would have said maybe on certain days did like to cut deals, who lost that Senate race. And it's a young delegation now, and I don't know if I necessarily see anybody kind of stepping up to cut those cross-aisle deals. We're very young. We don't have that seniority on committees that you kind of need to actually be a leader to cut those kinds of deals. Our delegation's a lot less centrist than it was, which makes it a lot harder. I could maybe see somebody like Buddy Carter, who now is becoming a little more senior, perhaps taking that role, but he's expressed interest in running for Senate. So maybe he'll be gone too if he doesn't end up winning in the primary. So I don't necessarily see anybody taking those roles. And to a certain extent, there's something kind of lost there because you're seeing more and more our delegation kind of splitting along partisan lines, and there are fewer and fewer things that unite them. I would say maybe the Savannah port right now and the water wars are kind of the two main issues that unite them, but fewer and fewer things that do.
Thank you.
Tamar, Georgia, you're talking about the Georgia delegation, how much it's changed even since 2020. The Georgia delegation seemed to have considerable influence while Donald Trump was president within the Trump administration, either through Senator David Perdue and his relationship with his cousin, Sonny Perdue, the former Secretary of Agriculture, the Trump administration's vocal support for Kelly Loeffler's Senate campaign. How did you see that that support or that influence or give and take that some of the folks in the delegation had within the Trump administration? How did you see that play out while you were covering it on Capitol Hill, and you know, what's it like now with the new Biden administration?
Sure. I mean, you saw that poll almost immediately within weeks of Donald Trump being sworn in. I remember there was a meeting that the president held with Republican leaders on Capitol Hill. So they all went to the White House. I'm talking Mitch Mcconnell and his deputy, Kevin McCarthy and his deputy. And who else was sitting at that table? David Perdue, you know, then a freshman senator who wasn't a member of leadership, so really didn't have any other reason to be there other than Donald Trump invited him, and it's because they had a very close relationship. And so right off the bat, I knew it was going to be very different. You know, whereas before, like I mentioned, David Perdue was a freshman, so not normally somebody you pay a ton of attention to. So that was my moment when I knew, oh, they are serious political allies, and I'm going to have to pay close attention to everything David Perdue does as it relates to Donald Trump. And I think a great example of his poll and kind of what Georgia was able to get out of that is the Savannah port. That was a project where the state ended up fronting some money, and they needed the feds to end up giving, I think it was about 2/3 of the money to help. This is to deepen the Savannah port from 42 to 47 feet to allow for these giant ships from the Panama Canal to come and unload at the port. It was something they were desperately requesting money from the Obama administration, and it was something they weren't really getting, or it was just coming really, really slow, and they were worried their construction timeline would have to be delayed. and Trump loves these big splashy projects, and it was something that was kind of on the precedent, kind of ready to go, and all he needed to do was approve money. So kind of an easy win. And so you saw the federal spigot, more and more money come out really fast for that project. And I think that was a moment where David Perdue was able to kind of use his close relationship with the president to get something done for the state. And so there are other things where he talked about, his influence with the president on issues like tax reform or immigration, where it was a little more behind the scenes, things that maybe ended up in a initial White House offer, an initial bill that ended up on the Hill, or things that were taken out. But the port was kind of a big early win for Georgia in that presidency. Oh, and as for Biden, and Ossoff and Warnock, again, freshman lawmakers at the same time, those two are the ones who are responsible for Democrats having a majority in the Senate. And so Joe Biden and especially Chuck Schumer owe them a lot. And you've been seeing time after time, week after week on the Hill, all the things Chuck Schumer has been doing as sort of a thank you to them. He ended up awarding each of them subcommittee gavels, perches for them to kind of show to Georgia voters just how powerful and helpful they can be. And especially for somebody like Reverend Warnock to go back home now that he has to run for re-election next year and show, here's what I've been able to get for you in Washington voters, please re-elect me. So.
We just got a question from the audience talking about Sanford Bishop, his long career in the House of Representatives. If I'm right, Sanford Bishop was elected first back in 1992, which I believe he's with the passing of Representative Lewis, he's the dean of the Georgia congressional delegation.
Yeah.
So, what was it like covering Representative Bishop, and how has his influence played out on Capitol Hill over the years?
Yeah, Congressman Bishop is a little bit press shy. And so I sometimes found it hard to grab him. He's a very kind of bookish, quiet man. He holds a very senior position on the House Appropriations Committee, and he has huge influence over spending bills, which are some of the only bills that end up going through Congress now, must pass bills to keep the government open. And he specifically now helps oversee the Department of Agriculture, huge for Georgia, and so a hugely influential position for him. And now even more influential with the return of earmarks, now that the two parties have agreed on that. So that'll certainly put him in a more powerful position, but he's not the same kind of character as a David Perdue or a Johnny Isakson. He's a much more quieter guy. He always, kind of very studious, and always kind of what can he do quietly to help his district in Southwest Georgia, which includes Columbus and Albany and a lot of rural farmland, using that appropriations process to kind of help his district. So influential in his way, not necessarily the loud cable news loving kind of lawmaker who ends up taking up a lot of the political oxygen on Capitol Hill. Very old school in a way.
Tamar, can I jump in and ask you a wonky question? And that is, I've never seen as much coverage of the fate of the filibuster as I have since the election and the runoff and everything else. And I'm just curious to see, the filibuster has been evolving even before the 2020 cycle, and I'd love to get your take on how policymakers or legislators in particular in the Senate have viewed the filibuster over time, and kind of how the politics of the filibuster are shifting right now. Because again, this is super wonky, and maybe I'm the only one who thinks this is a cool question, but I think it's a cool question. I'd be curious to see, based on your experience, what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, it's something that I think is very central to the Senate and its personality, and why it's such a unique place. Of course, the filibuster, all you need is 40 senators, so not even a majority to stall legislation. And it doesn't need to be the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington standing on the floor, talking your head off for 20 hours. All you need to say is call up the cloakroom and say, hey, I want to filibuster this bill. And if you have 40 lawmakers, that's all you need. And I think you've seen the partisan division over time end up eating away at this support for the filibuster. You initially saw this especially over nominees. White House nominees to the judiciary and to cabinet level positions, frustration with whichever party was the same as the president in the White House. The minority is blocking our nominees. Why can't we have this? And so you saw increasing standoffs, and you saw with Harry Reid. I'm trying to remember what year was it? Maybe 2013. The Democratic majority leader wanting to invoke the nuclear option. He got really tired of Republicans slow walking Barack Obama's nominees, and so decided to change the Senate rules, which all it takes is 51
Simple
votes.
Majority.
Yeah, exactly. So ended up eliminating the filibuster on most nominees, and so when Republicans were in power later, they ended up doing the exact same thing for Supreme Court nominees to get Neil Gorsuch through the door, and then later Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. So we've seen
Mitch McConnell famously gave a floor speech and said, "You'll be sorry," when Reid did that, and he's like, "You'll be sorry when we have this. You're gonna be sorry about this."
Exactly, and very reminiscent of what you're hearing now as Democrats are talking more and more about getting rid of the filibuster on legislation. You can still block bills on healthcare, immigration, anything with 40 votes. You're seeing Democrats agitate, and Mitch McConnell, I can't remember the exact term, but he's saying, the Senate will become a graveyard or a 100-car pileup, or it was something like that. And I think that's very true. It takes the consent of all 100 senators to even adjourn for the day or allow for committee meetings. And so it could become an absolute mess. At the same time, the longer I cover this, the more I think we might inevitably kind of end up there, because I think, especially we talk about the power of the base, and especially the liberal base right now for the Democrats are getting so frustrated. Okay, Joe Biden has the presidency, they have a majority of the Senate, however narrow it is, a majority of the House, very narrow, yet you can't do most things that they want on something like minimum wage or universal health care or anything like that without 60 votes. And so I think eventually the base might agitate enough that they may get to that point. Schumer doesn't have the votes at this point to get rid of it. We just saw today Joe Manchin from West Virginia, a centrist, saying, I'm not interested in getting rid of the filibuster. And so I think we're going to see a lot more reliance on a very geeky thing called a reconciliation bill, which is how they ended up passing COVID relief earlier this spring. It's how Joe Biden's going to try and pass infrastructure later this year. And so I think the biggest things he's going to be able to get done are going to have to work within that process. And when he runs out of options, I think we're going to see renewed pressure on somebody like Joe Manchin to end the filibuster. And I wonder if it's only a matter of time before it gets gutted. And that'll fundamentally change the way the Senate works and make it just like the House, where you get total whiplash, depending on, whoever's in the majority, they can kind of railroad the minority. And it feels like we're kind of getting that way in politics.
Yeah. Let me ask you this random question. Would you be surprised if either a Republican senator or a Democratic senator switched party? Because in a 50-50 scenario, I mean, it's certainly something that we saw in the late 90s, early 2000s, these periods. I mean, all it takes is one deal to give someone a committee gavel and you could utterly shift the balance of power.
I wonder, but there's fewer and fewer people in the middle there who are even kind of poachable for the other side, because, Johnny Isakson was considered a centrist when he was there, and he really wasn't on most things. Like he was considered a centrist because he was willing to talk to Democrats, which if that basic thing means you're a centrist, that goes to show just how conservative and just how liberal people are. There's so few people in the middle, and there are, maybe there are about 5 people who.
Yeah, I think you're about right. I think about 5. Yeah.
Yeah, like maybe a Joe Manchin or a Kirsten Sinema or a Susan Collins
or Lisa Murkowski or someone like that.
But maybe, but I don't know. I think it's hard with the primary system. You look at somebody like Lisa Murkowski, who's in such trouble, with her primary already, and I don't necessarily think she could get elected as a Democrat in a state like Alaska. So I don't know. If I've learned anything covering politics as many years as I have, is I don't know anything anymore, especially with Donald Trump. I remember when John Ossoff entered the race to replace Tom Price in 2017. I said, oh, he's a Democrat in the 6th district, next, no chance. And he almost won it. So I've learned that the more I know, the less I actually know. And so who am I to predict what's going to happen? Because I'm still surprised by what happens sometimes in DC.
You've been talking, Tamar, about Chuck Schumer wrangling his 50-50 Senate, so his effective one vote majority with the vice president. What about Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives? Speaker Pelosi's on her second go round as Speaker, and she too has a restive base, an increasingly liberal, maybe liberal's not the right word, but an increasingly progressive or left base. You mentioned AOC earlier, but other members of the so-called squad, but also just the Democratic caucus in the House is becoming more progressive. And the Democratic majority in the House is not that large, especially with appointments to the Biden cabinet. Representative Alcee Hastings just passed away yesterday, I believe. So I think the Democratic majority may be in single digits at this point.
Yeah, I think it's only 3 or 4 right now.
Right.
Yeah.
So the effective governing majority of the Democrats in the House is very, very small. How based on your coverage of Nancy Pelosi, how does Nancy Pelosi manage to govern that caucus? And it does seem, regardless of the various voices within the party, it seems to be a very cohesive caucus, even still.
She's proven to be super effective at keeping her Democrats together. And I think part of that strategy is just literally sitting there and listening to them and letting people kind of scream their head off, cry their eyes out, and just kind of like, okay, are you good? Or what do I need to give you to get you to a yes? And she's proven her whole career that she's very good at that. And what's so interesting at kind of the problems facing Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi is they're kind of at different ends of the spectrum. Pelosi has proven she's been able to kind of keep her group of moderates in check. And she's been able to kind of placate them pretty well, even the ones who voted against her becoming speaker back in 2019. After they recaptured the majority. I think where she needs to be more careful are the super progressive members of her caucus, the AOCs, the Rashida Tlaibs, the Ayanna Presleys of her group, especially AOC, who there's talk of her primarying Chuck Schumer in the next couple of years. Whereas I think for Schumer in the Senate, his issue are the moderates, the Joe Manchins and the Kirsten Sinemas. And so things Nancy Pelosi may need to do to placate the left to get a bill through the House are exactly the sorts of things that might piss off the centrists in the Senate. And so they not only have to manage people in their own chambers, but make sure that what they get through can pass the other chamber. And I think that's where the challenges are going to lie. Nancy Pelosi has been around for so long. I think she's kind of proven that she can do it. For Schumer, he's a little bit newer at the job. He finally got his promotion that he's been dying for his whole life to be Senate Majority Leader, but it was Harry Reid for so long that controlled the Democrats in the Senate. So I think he's newer to the job, and I think it'll be a little more challenging for him just because I don't think he's had as much experience doing that.
We just got an audience question that goes back to Tamar, what you and Joe were talking about the political center in Washington, and based on your reporting and your experience on the Hill, is that middle? I don't know that the middle ever goes away, but it shifts, like you said. What is the future of the political middle or the political centrist in a place like a highly polarized Capitol Hill?
I mean, it's becoming harder and harder to be there, and I think it becomes more and more of a liability for you in your primary. So even if it's harder for you to win a primary, and so it's harder for those people to keep getting reelected and end up in Washington. And so even the people who are considered the centrists now are not all that centrist. Even like somebody like Lucy McBath, who is sort of considered a centrist in the House, or at least has joined centrist coalitions because of the district she represents, which for so long was a Republican district. Lucy McBath is pretty darn, center left. And so I think you're put in more and more of a precarious spot on Capitol Hill, and there are fewer and fewer things. You're even seeing somebody like Joe Biden, who's always kind of marketed himself as a centrist, getting pushed more and more to the left to appeal to his restive base. And so It's a really hard and lonely place to be in right now in Washington, because not only are you pissing off, the other side as usual, they're going to oppose you no matter what, but you're pissing off people in your own party, and it's a really untenable place to be right now.
So Tamar, here's a question that we hadn't teed up, but I was curious to see, a lot of when President Biden ran for office, he championed his experience in the Senate. And I think if you go back historically, I was just thinking about it. Obama was obviously a one-term senator, and he didn't spend a lot of time in the Senate before he became in the White House. To find someone who spent as much time in the Senate as Joe Biden, you've got to go back to Nixon or LBJ or something like that to find someone. But I'm curious if you see any indications of that experience so far, because it was something that was talked about a lot, but I'm not sure if we've seen the kind of deal making or anything. Obviously, the climate's changed tremendously, as we've been talking about. But I just think that's an area for me that I'm curious to see if there's any real difference that we see between someone who has a substantial amount of congressional and Senate experience, as coming into the presidency, versus those who haven't, and whether it seems to be making much of a difference.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see that too, especially the relationship between Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden, because I want to say they were kind of friends when they were in the Senate. Maybe friends is a strong word, but they sort of liked each other. And I remember from the Obama years when, Obama had notoriously bad relationships with Republicans on the Hill. Whenever he really needed to negotiate something, he would send in Joe Biden to get it done. At the same time, it took Mitch McConnell weeks after the November election to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the White House. And so far, what you've seen from him is
and he's still getting kicked like a dog for doing what he did then.
Exactly. But you're seeing a posture out of Mitch McConnell right now that's not all that different from kind of the blanket opposition you saw him give Obama when he was around. Like, if Obama's for it, I'm against it. You're kind of seeing something similar now. So it's going to be really interesting to look on infrastructure, because it's not like, I don't think Democrats gave Republicans a whole lot of chance on the COVID relief bill to kind of buy in and help craft it very much. It'll be interesting to see how much buy-in they give Republicans on infrastructure. And their posture has changed a little bit over the last couple of weeks. Initially, it seemed like Democrats were really intent to go it alone on infrastructure and get a massive bill without any Republican support. But in recent days, you've kind of seen Democrats say, no, this is an opening offer. We want to work with Republicans. This is an issue on the one hand that somebody like Donald Trump has talked forever about wanting to do an infrastructure deal. At the same time, I'm not convinced how much incentive Republicans have to give somebody like Joe Biden a victory right now, especially if that could lead to taxes being raised, which is, of course, a core tenet of the party. And then one last point on this, you talk about being a creature of the Senate. I was surprised and I wasn't surprised when you saw Biden ease up a little bit when it came to the filibuster. You'd figured as an institutionalist, he would really defend it. And he hasn't called for its outright removal, but he's also mentioned wanting to make a lot of huge changes to the way you can do a filibuster in the Senate. So that goes to show he has to listen to his base, who are really calling for it to be removed. So it goes to show he maybe isn't as much of the stalwart institutionalist as we saw, and he might be willing to change because his base is so fervently against the filibuster.
And Tamar, I wonder how much of that is attributable, because, when I first became acquainted with the filibuster, I worked as a Senate staffer or whatever, the filibuster in 2021 seems to be synonymous with Southern Democrats filibustering civil rights legislation. And in fact, it was an issue that came up during the primary and everything else. And so, part of it is, I wonder what the popular perception of the filibuster, what they think of it is. It's different now than it might have been in like 2000 or 1990 or something like that now, even though those periods were closer to when it was used in that way. But I think now, I think that there's been so much effort to reframe the filibuster by people who are opposed to it as basically a segregationist tool, that I think it's rendered it much more politically toxic than it may ever have been in its history, which is interesting to me.
Absolutely. And talk about a way to fire up your base and kind of demonize the other side. It also goes to show how much hunger there is for Washington to do something, anything on a policy issue. The sides are so gridlocked, they can't even do the most basic types of legislating on issues that people agree need to be changed. And so there's such a thirst now for Washington to do anything. And the filibuster has made that really hard. And so you're seeing the left right now kind of chomping at the bit because they have the majority. If they don't touch the filibuster, you could see the right the next time Republicans have all levers of power, maybe being tempted to do the same. At the same time, people have to remember, your party will be in the minority at one point, and you're going to wish you had that filibuster. So you could see, or if it's gone away, you're going to see just whiplash. Democrats are in charge. We're going to do all sorts of gun control and universal health care and changes to immigration. And then Republicans come, no, let's reverse all of that and gun rights and private health care and get rid of anything having to do with climate change. Like, things will be so head spinning, and it'll be, maybe that's something people want.
It'll be like being in the British Parliament.
Exactly. It'll be hard to keep track of, in the same way now I find it hard to keep track of executive orders. But maybe that's what people want. There's so much delayed, Washington hasn't done anything in so long, any major legislating on any issues, because they're so gridlocked. Maybe the American people decide they're over the filibuster, want to get rid of it. It's, the downsides are worth it for the rewards you get when you're in the minority.
So I was, Tamar, you were talking about nothing getting done in Washington, and that's always the biggest complaint of any long-term office maker. Lamar Alexander retired, and he'd been a fixture in Southern politics since the late 1970s in Tennessee. But others, they give their final speeches, and it's the Senate doesn't get anything done. The Senate doesn't work. Congress doesn't work. And I can't remember. I believe it was one of the Udalls, the senator from New Mexico who retired, Mark or Tom. Mark. And he gives a speech, and he says, the Senate doesn't work. The filibuster is broken because it forces both parties back into their corners. Lamar Alexander says, no, we have to save the filibuster because it forces compromise. How have senators and others in Washington tried to make heads or tails of those arguments? Like, how can it ever work if those are the two positions of relatively moderate members of their respective parties?
In my eyes, I think they have to be incentivized by the broader political system to talk to each other. And right now, because of where we are with like the rhetoric in our country and how polarized we are, you're just not incentivized the way the primary system is, because I think the role of something like social media or cable news, it really does force people to be extremes. And so, like how we were talking about how the moderates have been kind of hollowed out, you're not incentivized to elect people in a primary who want to talk to the other side. So I don't necessarily think any kind of rules changes. I wonder how many rules changes in the Senate could actually make a difference if the people who are getting elected are elected on platforms kind of my way or the highway. And so I'm kind of skeptical of any sort of rules changes. There's been talk over the years of doing similar things with the budget process. Maybe if you tweak the way things are done, it'll make it easier to do stuff like that. And I just think that the problems are so much more deep-seated and kind of broader systematically that I wonder how much a rules change could really make a difference. Because if you get rid of the filibuster, you just kind of piss more people off. Whoever's in the minority party, you're going to piss them off because you railroad them. So I don't necessarily think it's going to make anything better. When you're in the majority, your side will get more of what you want. But then the other side will be out for more revenge. So.
Audrey, we haven't heard from you in a while. Do you have any questions?
Oh, I've been holding back
in the chamber.
Yes.
Sure.
So I was thinking to focus now on your public policy work, Tamara, and this is a tough question, but I think today was an eventful day because there were some rollbacks, right, in terms of some of the COVID rules regulating behavior in the state. And so as someone who's here at the University of Georgia campus, I noticed quite a lot of activity. There were some bars open already with people in them at, I believe, 11:30 this morning. Sad to say. But so you've been probably, paying some attention to that issue. And one thing that strikes me is that I recently saw a graphic where the amount of vaccinations was shown with color. And Georgia was the palest state with just I think maybe Virginia was one that was very pale. Why do you, when you cover it, I know it's tough, but why do you think that we're so far behind so many other states when it comes to vaccinations at this point? And also maybe when you're covering public policy, what's the difference between covering public policy and all of the actors involved, especially in a very controversial area like this, and then covering members of Congress? That seems like another time where you'd have to kind of go back and shift how you present things, especially to an audience that is a general audience and pretty bifurcated on their attitudes.
Yeah, I think it's hard to divorce politics from policy. And I think my background covering politics really helps me as I cover policy, especially something like COVID, just how much political affiliation can impact how likely or how likely you are to want to get a vaccine. When we talk about people like the governor who are in decision-making roles, how much their political identity kind of governs, first of all, the sorts of mandates you might have for something like a lockdown or lifting restrictions, but also people who are about to face re-election, like Brian Kemp, and who, he really angered Donald Trump, and by extension, all of Donald Trump's supporters because of his refusal to overturn the election results, which would have been illegal. Kemp couldn't have done it, but the fact that Trump kept saying, no, you could have, is enough for all of his supporters. So you have to think about the position Kemp is in with his base. And he wants to run again next year, and he has to kind of listen to what his people want. You're seeing it now with the way he's talking about vaccine passports and how that's not something he wants, like some sort of government document that tells you whether you can or cannot participate in public life. And so I think having that politics background has really helped me understand why Georgia's doing the things it's doing, especially compared to a state like where I grew up in Virginia, which has become a blue state. It was not one when I grew up, but I think it's been helpful to look at it that way. It's hard to divorce them. Even something like COVID, which you would think would be governed by public policy considerations or science ones, but no, nothing is divorced from politics.
Speaking of public policy, you made the transition from Washington correspondent to senior reporter in 2019, 2020. So right now, the policy talk on all the shows, as they say, on the Sunday shows and the podcasts and everything, is Georgia's new voting law. How in your coverage, how did you see why that bill developed in the General Assembly the way it did, and through its signing, and how does that fit in with Georgia's current political moment, its sort of emergence as a national swing state, as a potentially realigning state? What's your take on the bill, and what should we expect coverage-wise going forward?
I mean, I think certainly that's why we've seen so much national attention paid to this bill. I mean, there's always, whenever you talk about voting rights in Washington, Georgia was always kind of on the tips of people's tongue just because of its role in the civil rights movement, having somebody like John Lewis kind of on the front lines. People were always talking about that. I was there right after the Supreme Court rolled back aspects of the Voting Rights Act. So it was all, people were always paying attention, but then especially because of the Senate seats flipping and Joe Biden winning Georgia, we were always going to get that sort of attention on this law. And I will say, as a reporter, it was hard to follow because there were so many different bills that had been introduced in the State House. And so you really didn't see much national attention because maybe the nationals were thinking, we don't really know what's going to happen, you know, we'll give it time. But as a reporter here on the ground, you know, you're trying to figure out what's going to happen. Are all of these going to be combined at the end of the day? Which one really has, you know, much momentum behind it? And so we really didn't know. Or for a while there was talk about getting rid of all or no excuse absentee voting. And so that's a pretty extreme proposal. And so that got a lot of the attention. That didn't end up being in the final bill. We thought they'd initially go to conference, you know, the House and the Senate versions of the bill, and that didn't happen either. There was a final bill that just kind of materialized out of thin air one day, and it ended up getting approved within that day or the very next one. So things purposefully were moved very fast, and it became really hard. And you see a lot of Republican anger at the way that the media portrayed the bill, and you know, people are talking about provisions that didn't end up in the final bill. And in the media's defense, I think it was hard to follow because there were so many versions of that bill, and you know, they ended up approving a 98-page bill that materialized almost out of thin air. So people really didn't have time to see what was in the final bill, and it was hard to figure out which draft we were talking about. So there's certainly that. And I think the star power of Stacey Abrams and how she really has become a national figure since 2018 has also certainly fueled national interest in all of this. And I think you see a lot of the national publications kind of fixate on her, which I know a lot of Republicans in the state get really frustrated about. And she's been able to, I think, really shape the narrative that you see nationally. And Republicans will argue they haven't gotten the fair shake in all of this. I won't weigh in on that, but it certainly has made it a challenge to cover these proposals.
So what's the difference between covering Capitol Hill and the Gold Dome, Tamar?
I don't cover the Golden Dome every day. I have the luxury of getting to drop in and out, which is fun. I like it. I like covering the Golden Dome because the term isn't loosey-goosey, but it's a little less controlled. What I like about Capitol Hill compared to the White House is it's less controlled, but the legislature is even less so because these members don't have giant staffs. You know, they might have one person who works from them who they share with somebody else. So the lawmakers are so accessible. You know, you have their cell phone numbers, you can walk right up to them. And I find that it's really fun to kind of cover because it is so, it's such an undercovered place. There's less competition to cover it than there is nationally. And there is so much going on, and there is so much more of an opportunity to get to shine a light on what legislators are doing here. The Hill is teeming with reporters, but what's so neat about the State House is there is a lot of room to break news as a reporter, and Georgia is on the front lines of so many interesting debates. We have so many interesting young stars who are kind of coming up through the legislature, who are starting to like talk about running statewide, and so it's a really fun time to get to cover it.
I always thought it was easier to find the bathrooms in Washington than,
I agree.
than Atlanta. I don't know what the deal is with that, but that was always my impression anyway.
Well, so much of them, this is definitely true in Washington, and I believe this was the case in the State House as well, is that they were built for men only. You know, women either expressly weren't allowed or they really couldn't be elected. And so even getting a woman's bathroom, I remember on Capitol Hill was a huge thing, you know, right off, you know, a couple steps from the House floor. And so I believe that was also an issue in the Gold Dome, and especially getting also space for young mothers to nurse and stuff has also been a huge fight that's still playing out today. But yeah, it's cool to be here in this moment and to watch so much of it change in real time, especially how many women are getting elected and like young representatives of color, and you're seeing the LGBT caucus grow, and it's just a cool time to be covering a state that's changing so fast.
I don't know when our time ends, but I have one question that I would like to ask Tamar, and I think some members of our audience might be interested in it too. You know, part of the reason we're getting so much attention is because of the fact that, you know, we're considered to be dynamic. There have been Republicans who have been shifting some of their practitioner work in anticipation of Georgia becoming at least a far more purple state. You know, we have changed in the past, right? And maybe some of the attention that we're getting now is because of that sort of dynamic nature. But given that, and given like the announcement today, we saw reading in the AJC, of course, because you don't know anything that's going on in the state unless you read the AJC. You know, Jeff Duncan, our lieutenant governor, who has, you know, played a very interesting role in multiple levels of some of the controversies with the Stop the Steal or own voting rights, you know, basically has announced that, you know, I'm not going to be running, but I am going to be engaged in trying to influence Republican Party, and as he phrases it, 2.0. So, you know, given that, Tamara, you have a real insight into our congressional delegation, into the movers and shakers of public policy at the executive level and all these things. You know, you don't want to make a prediction, I'm sure, but do you have a sense of, you know, what the conflict will be like? Will the party of Republicans in the state of Georgia be, you know, Trump 1.0 or, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene 2.0 or Jeff Duncan 2.0? Where's it going? Or is it going to be some odd mix? And for how long do you think that the transition will go on? And maybe you can say something about the Democratic Party too.
Sure. Well, I've learned enough not to make real predictions, but I will say it's noteworthy, first of all, how lonely Jeff Duncan is in his position right now, being one of the lone voices of opposition to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And I will say in Georgia, it's really hard to be elected here right now and to not be kind of firmly pro-Trump. You know, you might want to keep him arm's distance, maybe if you're from Metro Atlanta, but you really cannot be elected and be anti-Trump here. And I see that perhaps continuing. It'll be interesting to see how much momentum, how much money Jeff Duncan can pull together for this initiative of his. And maybe this is something longer term that might make an impact. I will be very curious to see whether Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger can make it out of their primaries and how much of a force Donald Trump can be for Mar-a-Lago in helping endorse and kind of set up these primary challenges, because obviously he hates Brian Kemp. We've seen that even after the voting law was signed, with Trump putting out statements not so complimentary of Brian Kemp even after that. Some people see this voting law as a way for Kemp to redeem himself to the Republican base, and it'll be interesting to see if that's indeed the case. As for Democrats, they clearly are, you know, have a skip in their step. I'll be very surprised if Stacey Abrams doesn't run for governor. And I think if she does run again, she'll bring with her a lot of national attention, and it'll be even, you know, I can see national publications either opening or reopening a bureau in Atlanta or kind of staffing up, because clearly Georgia is proving to be kind of at the center of kind of changing America, or very emblematic of sort of these demographic changes. And so that'll be interesting to see too. I'll be curious that the Democrats that end up stepping up to challenge Chris Carr, you know, we hear names like State Senator Jen Jordan, whoever ends up stepping up to challenge Brad Raffensperger, how much momentum they can have. If what happened in November and then again in January in Georgia was kind of a one-off, if it was because Donald Trump was on the ballot and he was so viewed so negatively in Metro Atlanta, especially among suburban women, or whether this is, you know, a train has kind of left the station and you know, it's Democrats' game. I'm not convinced of that yet, but certainly this was a huge moment. And I think it's riled up a lot of Democrats to show like, hey, we need to keep pushing, we need to keep organizing, we need to keep donating. And so I'll be curious to see how much we get in 2022, especially because there's not a presidential race on the ballot. That might be enough for a lot of low propensity voters to stay home. And I think that would hurt Democrats a lot. So we'll see. But who am I to say? I didn't think, like I said, there's so many stories I've gotten wrong in terms of who's up and who's down over the years that everything is surprising and nothing is surprising anymore. So who knows? You know, we didn't think Donald Trump, we didn't think Brian Kemp was going to be he was not the favorite to win the gubernatorial race in 2018. We all thought it was going to be Casey Cagle. And so how much things can change, how much something like a tweet from Donald Trump, especially, like nothing can match that in terms of one event that can really shake up a race. And so I think we're going to see stuff like that play out over the next 18 months.
We've got time for about one more question. We wrap at 2:30. Joe, do you have a question you'd like to close with for tomorrow?
No, I will cede my my outstanding question to the audience.
Sure. I think here's a really interesting one that could be very, very open-ended, Tamar. Is from your time in Washington, what is one or what are some of the misconceptions about Washington if all you ever do is watch cable news or read your Facebook feed or Twitter? What are those misconceptions that you can allay for us as our time expires here?
There is serious policy making that is still happening. Like in general, there aren't like the big giant bills that everybody wants, but there are still ways to affect change, and often they're buried in very wonky ways. Like we saw with the COVID bill, huge change for these child tax credits, and it's actually going to be a huge entitlement reform that could have a huge impact on child poverty. There's lots of changes people have learned how to make behind the scenes in little spending bills. Mitch McConnell was a master of this, burying some provision that looks really innocuous when you read the sentence, but actually it's a huge deal, and it's buried on page 828 of a 1,000-page bill. So there still are ways to get stuff done. It's just not as sexy as it once would have been. I think also, overall, there still is a huge mistrust between the parties, but you do get to see these moments here and there, these kind of unexpected friendships that pop up between Democrats and Republicans, even with reporters and lawmakers there are certain lawmakers who might have the reputation of being kind of a showboat or being hyper partisan, but sometimes you talk to them off the record and you get to know them, and it's sort of a game they're playing or a role, like they're an actor or something. And there still is a bit of that that people don't really see. So I remember there's a member in the Georgia delegation, I won't mention who it was, but somebody who's kind of sharp-elbowed. And people would ask me, who in the delegation do you have the best rapport with? And I'd always say that person, like, oh, wait, what? No, they're on TV all the time attacking the other side. Yeah, but off the record, they're really clear-eyed and smart and easy to talk to and accessible. And so sometimes people would be surprised at the people who are that. And sometimes they're Republican. People think Republicans hate the press, but that's not always the case. Some of the best sources have been Republicans for me. So I wish people could kind of see a little bit more of those moments, the fun, weird friendships you see between Democrats and Republicans, and that kind of get lost sometimes on C-SPAN or on Fox or MSNBC.
Well, Tamar, thank you very much for a wonderful afternoon, very informative and entertaining, which is always a great mix to have. Joe Watson, Audrey Haynes, thank you very much for participating, and thank you everybody for attending this Congress Week activity. And on behalf of everybody here at the Russell Library at the University of Georgia, thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Bye, Tamar.
Thanks, guys. Nice to meet you.
Bye, Tamar is great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes.
Have a great afternoon, everybody.